They called it the perfect crime. For 6 years the city of Boston, the FBI, and a nation wondered who had robbed the unrobbable. Brinks, the company whose name was synonymous with armored security itself. On a cold January night in 1950, a band of criminals walked into an armored depot, took millions in cash, and vanished into the winter. For decades the story read like fiction, a heist planned with precision, executed with nerve, and followed by confusion, betrayal, and a slow, grinding unraveling. This is the Brink's job. Part 1. A quiet city and a bold idea. Boston in 1950 was a city of brick factories, shipping yards and tight neighborhoods where people watched out for one another. Brinks had become an institution, armored trucks, locked vaults, men in blue uniforms entrusted with the world's money. To rob Brinks was to rob a fortress. To rob Brinks successfully required more than courage. It required time, patience, and a willingness to think like an engineer. The seeds of the heist were not born overnight. They sprouted in the minds of small-time thieves and veterans of wartime black markets. Among them were men who had the skill to pick locks, the patience to study routines, and the audacity to imagine a different life. Tony, Fat Pino, a man with a low voice and meticulous habits, became the de facto organizer. Others, Joe Specs O'Keefe, Joe Bats Maggio, and Adolf Jazz Maffei, brought experience, bravado, or reliable muscle. These men weren't Hollywood bank robbers. They were craftsmen of crime, methodical, and surprisingly ordinary in their day-to-day lives. Part 2. Reconnaissance, study, sleep, repeat. What set the Brinks job apart was the planning. The gang spent more than 2 years watching the depot. They rented rooms nearby, took jobs as watchmen and truck drivers, learned schedules, and mapped the building like engineers surveying a bridge. They watched the guards change shifts. They noted lunch breaks and the rhythm of deliveries. They learned which doors were locked, which locks were old, and which windows were rarely checked. They even timed how long it took employees to walk from the street to the counting rooms. Key details mattered, the combination on the safe changed, the locks had specific make and model quirks, and Brink's procedures relied as much on habit as on hardware. The men observed that employees sometimes left doors propped open and that waste money was thrown into certain bins. They found routes that avoided cameras and lines of sight. They practiced the movements they would later execute: how to carry canvas sacks, how to silence bolts, how to move quickly without clumsiness. This was not a gang of amateurs. This was a study in logistics. They rehearsed with stopwatches. They removed small fixtures and replaced them later. They tested uniforms. They rationed tasks. It was a criminal operations manual written in the stairwells of Boston. Part 3. The tools of the trade. Because a job at Brinks meant moving millions of dollars in a short window, the gang prepared tools and contingencies. They obtained hacksaws, chisels, rope, crowbars, and uniforms. They secured a truck that would not attract attention, forged documentation for staging, and identified friendly garages where the truck could be hidden. They bypassed locks by studying their internal components. Some locks were older and could be manipulated without great force. Integral to their plan was stealth and speed. They would need to be in and out while maintaining control over any witnesses. They knew the layout of the counting room and the method by which currency was banded and sorted. Most importantly, they wanted to avoid shooting and minimize violence, an approach that would reduce the penalties should they be caught and also reduce mistakes born of panic. Part 4. The night, January 17, 1950. When the night arrived, their preparation read like choreography. Under the cover of winter darkness, the gang moved into position. They approached the Brinks Depot in Braintree, Massachusetts, a location chosen because of the depot's routines and access roads. The men used dimmed headlights and avoided main roads. Timing was everything. They used a simple but effective deception to get inside, posing as maintenance men or delivery staff, gaining entrance through familiarity rather than force. Once inside, they moved quickly into the counting room. With practiced hands they bound tellers, secured vault doors, and took precisely what they intended: $2.775 million in cash and checks, tens of millions in today's money. The whole operation, from entry to exit, was executed efficiently, with no gunfire, no alarm triggered, and no tragic injuries. They loaded sacks into waiting vehicles and dispersed into the cold night. For the first hours, neighbors suspected nothing. For the first day, authorities were baffled. How did anyone penetrate Brink's? How did they carry so much money without detection? The questions hung in the air like frost. Part 5. The Aftermath, A Nation in Shock. When morning dawned and the loss was discovered, the scale hit the papers. $2.775 million in 1950 was staggering, a life-altering sum. The media called it the crime of the century. The FBI arrived, launching an investigation that would consume years and hundreds of aging hours. Yet in those early days, leads were thin. The thieves had left little. They were careful about paper trails. They had avoided firing weapons. They had used vehicles that were hard to trace. For a time, it seemed as if the money had evaporated into the ether. But the heist had human elements: pride, greed, and the inevitable mistakes people make when the adrenaline fades and the money is counted. The gang divided the spoils and celebrated. They purchased houses, cars, and the trappings of suddenly elevated status. In doing so, they created patterns that investigators could study. They tipped their hands through loose talk in bars, through sudden purchases, and through petty quarrels over shares. Part 6. The Investigation, Patience Wins. The FBI, in collaboration with local police, methodically pieced together leads. They interviewed employees, retraced the gang's steps, and used informants. Over time, the trail warmed. Small mistakes by the perpetrators, a fingerprint here, an overheard remark there, started yielding names. One breakthrough came from seemingly mundane choices. Who among the small-time criminals suddenly had access to new money? Who bought a car they hadn't owned before? Who took trips without a job explanation? In other words, the thieves' flashy new lifestyles painted them as suspects in plain view. The case became a study in both forensic patience and old-fashioned legwork. It was detective work in its purest form: follow the money, follow human behavior, and pressure those with ties to the suspects until cracks appear. Part 7. Breakthroughs, Betrayal, Arrests. Within a few years, arrests followed. Not all the men went quietly or immediately. Some were arrested abroad, some attempted to hide within the very communities that once protected them. The arrests were the result of informants and confessions obtained under pressure. There were plea bargains, inter-gang resentments, and a cascade of cooperating witnesses that turned private grudges into prosecutable testimony. Perhaps the most dramatic elements of the story were not the arrests themselves but the betrayals among the thieves. As the net tightened, loyalty frayed. Men who had once rehearsed every detail together now traded names to reduce their own sentences. In the end, many of the perpetrators were convicted and given heavy sentences, lengthy prison terms that reflected both the crime's audacity and the shock it had caused the public. Part 8. The Missing Money. A persistent mystery of the Brink's job is how much of the money was recovered. Some of the cash was turned up in hidden stashes. Some was spent recklessly and lost. A substantial amount never resurfaced. The missing money added to the legend piles that melted into the economy via laundromats, black market exchanges, and untraceable transactions. Families, friends, and wives sometimes knew more than they admitted. With time, pieces of the payout would surface in unexpected places: a boat, a secreted crawl space, a return debt. But much of that $2.775 million remained unaccounted for, swallowed by decades. Part 9. Trials, Sentences, and Lives Changed. The trials were public spectacles. Newspapers printed the names and faces. Jurors listened to testimony about meticulous planning, the exact movements in the depot, and the attempts to hide the money. The sentencing reflected a desire to make an example. Long terms in prison awaited many. Some of the convicts later escaped, others served and returned to quieter lives, and a few died in obscurity. The ripple effects, broken families, ruined reputations, and the psychological costs of living on the run, lingered far beyond the courtroom. Part 10. The Legacy of the Brink's Job. Why does the Brink's job still grip us? Because it shows the collision of mundane routine and extraordinary audacity. It reveals how ordinary men, given time and planning, can attempt to subvert an institution. It also shows law enforcement's capacity to adapt, better security, improved procedures at armored depots, and an intensified focus on insider threats and employee vetting. Brink's itself changed how it operated, and armored security around the world took note. Culturally, the Brink's job fed a fascination with heist lore, films, books, and retellings that mythologize both the criminals and the lawmen who pursued them. We are drawn to stories that blur morality, criminals with codes of honor, police doing patient detective work, and the fog where chance and hubris intersect. Part 11. Lessons and Reflections. The Brink's job is more than a chronicle of theft. It is a lesson in logistics, in human psychology, and in the weaknesses at the seams of systems we trust. It underscores that security is not only about locks and alarms but about people, their routines, their assumptions, their moments of carelessness. It shows how a long, patient operation can exploit complacency, and how the same human nature that enables a crime also sows the seeds of its undoing. Closing. The crime that echoed. 60 years on, the figures and the facts retain their power. $2.775 million taken in one night. Years of study. A 6-year search. Arrests, trials, and long sentences. The money that disappeared became legend, and the men who executed the Brink's job became, for a time, almost mythic figures in the criminal imagination. Some called them geniuses. Others called them fools who could not keep their mouths shut. The truth sits somewhere between. A group of careful men who pulled off something extraordinary, and then, like all who play with fire, eventually paid the price. When you study the Brink's job, you study a perfect storm of ambition and opportunity, of technique and human error. It remains one of the greatest heists in history precisely because it was possible, and because, in the end, people made it so. Thanks for watching. If you like the video, like, share, subscribe and hit the notification bell to be notified on our future videos.